Thank you so much for having me, and I hope that someone has my presentation, is able to navigate through it. Will they put up my presentation? So thank you so much to IIT Madras for having me. And today I want to just take you through the journey that the Australian government went through over the last 3 years in addressing really the fundamental question of all of these technologies that we've been hearing about in the last session, of all the many options and pathways that countries have towards lowering their emissions, towards the prosperity and the jobs that we try to access through whether it's the hydrogen industry or electrifying various processes. How do we understand these technologies? How do governments select and choose which of those technologies to champion? And then finally, how do we then partner internationally in order to make those bring those technologies into cost competitiveness and broad deployment? If I can move to the next slide. About 3 years ago, in August of 2019, our Minister for Energy asked me and a small team in the Australian government to think about what our vision, the Australian government's vision for technology deployment in the low emissions tech space was, and how that would translate into priorities, clear and present priorities into 2030 and out into 2050. And in doing that, I had the great luxury of being able to talk to some of the most eminent scientists and businessmen in Australia in order to get their views on how we would build this vision and help the minister in developing this roadmap that he wanted. And one of those people was Dr. Alan Finkel, and he was the chief scientist at the time, and he was very fond of this quote by Buckminster Fuller, which says that you never change things by fighting the existing reality, but rather you change things by building new models that make the existing reality obsolete. And that was really one of the guiding sentiments that we had, that we, as the Australian government, weren't going to go about dismantling parts of our industry that were perhaps carbon intensive or trade exposed. We were going to embark on a process of really building a new model for the future that would then have such a compelling case for consumers and people who are users of electricity or green steel or whatever, that such a compelling case would be built that that new model would come into fruition. Can we go on to the next slide? Now, the first thing I realized when I was designing our initial briefing for the minister on how we would do this was that it is a very, very complex area. In fact, the team of sort of scientists that were advising me at the time identified in very, very short time more than 150 technologies that we would need to look at very seriously before we were able to pick just a few that we could in the near term support. And I want to just firstly focus on that idea in the first instance. One of the great things about working with scientists, and I'm sure I've only just arrived in India, but I'm sure it's very, very much the same here. One of the great things is that every scientist and professor that you speak to, who's a technologist, who's an engineer, or has been working on a particular technology, they will advocate for their technology. It is as though it is the only one that is in the whole world, and that is their answer to all of our problems. But when you start listening to many of these groups, it becomes very clear that as a government, you do need to have an ordered way of understanding which technologies you're going to prioritize. And then you have to understand that you probably will get that prioritization wrong year on year. So you have to adapt and be open to new technologies as they come along. So what we did was we got advisors and consultants to help us to develop a sort of very clear logical matrix by which we would, as the Australian government, iterate through developing these priority technologies and surveying which technologies were out there in order to work towards a vision. And this was the schematic and is the schematic that we now work to in Australia. And the reason that it's important in this context of international partnerships is this is the framework that Australia will be using to select the priorities that we will be supporting in the low emissions tech space. And this is the sort of schematic that we will like our partners to also help us in developing. And I'd like to quickly just run through this. The first, of course, before a government embarks on any kind of partnership or any kind of funding, has to be very clear what its vision is. Where is it trying to get to and by when? The second thing we decided to do was that we would survey, do a quick, fairly high-level survey of all of the new and emerging technologies that were available to us in trying to decarbonize our economy. And as I said earlier, we had a team of about 16 scientists and engineers and policymakers working in my task force, but we had a much larger team of people that we were consulting and working with to survey these 150 technologies. And they ranged from everything from small modular reactors to heat pumps. That was a very popular one in the building sector, to very new heat pumps, to green steel and green aluminium, DRI technologies, all the way to livestock feed supplements, the whole gamut. So we looked across our entire economy and we asked experts in each of those sectors to identify the technologies that they thought had capacity to deliver large emission reductions. Next, we went about asking the question, what is Australia good at? What are our comparative advantages? And what gaps do we have that we would, what special and unique needs we have as a country that we need to look for ways to bring in technology from outside in order to fill. Now, this is a really interesting stage of this analysis when you start thinking about partnership. And indeed, Australia's Prime Minister, when he met with Prime Minister Modi not long ago, said that we would embark on developing a partnership with India. And indeed, one of the things that we are trying to do is to understand in detail what Australia's comparative advantages are. On the other hand, what India's comparative advantages and strengths are, including in the space of research and development, and where those two things kind of come together to suggest that the two countries can have a meaningful partnership. So in this space, we of course, went out to industry and others, and what we found was, of course, that Australia is very strong in very discrete areas of research and development. For example, Australian PERC technology and solar research has long been world leading. And in fact, quite recently, a small team of researchers from the University of New South Wales broke the world record for efficiency of solar modules. And in a similar way, Australia had developed PERC technology, which is now in more than 80 or 90% of all solar modules in the world, including an Australian Australian technology. So solar was one, but others include, for example, carbon capture and storage, because Australia has invested over many years in that technology. And so we've developed research and development strengths in that area. So like that, we developed a list of all of the research and development strengths we had, but we also looked at things that are inherent to our economy, like, for example, the fact that we have a very large land mass with a lot of sun, a lot of wind. So it suggests that Australia can deploy renewables in a large way. If you'd like to read more about it, I can send you some links of some of the work that we've done back then. After identifying Australia's comparative strengths and our needs, we went through a process of prioritization. And to do this, we engaged the help of a panel of eminent Australians, including the head of Macquarie Bank, Shamara Vikramanayake, our chief scientist, Alan Finkel, but various other people who had a lot of strength in understanding different sectors of our economy. And my team then developed a lot of analytical work to help that panel advise the minister on which technologies they thought would have the biggest impact on Australia. And we looked very deeply at a fair few of those. Now, from there, I'm going to sort of race through this chart, but I wanted to convey the idea that Australia goes through this process now year on year. So we've just released our second technology statement, and that again, it surveys all of the technologies that we had. It updates the survey that we had done previously. It adds to the priorities that we've developed, and it runs through this same schematic to ensure that Australia is staying on top of the most recent technological developments. Can I move to the next slide, please? Now, I mentioned a vision, and this was actually one of the most interesting discussions I've had as a policymaker, was talking with that panel about how we condense what we're trying to achieve into a very, very simple idea. And what came out was that in Australia, what we are trying to do is to become a global leader in select low emissions technologies. And that global leadership will, of course, result in lower emissions, you know, as we deploy these technologies. It will result in prosperity for Australia, but really at its core, what Australia is trying to do and what we are trying to do with the international partnerships that we are developing is we are trying to lead the world in select low emissions technologies. And what exactly does leadership mean in that context? Well, leadership is more than just the technological breakthrough. You know, there's famous examples in the Australian system, I won't go into them, of where Australian innovators have come up with fantastic intellectual property, fantastic ideas, but then have gone offshore in order to promote them. That for me is part of, you know, making the scientific breakthrough is part of being a low emissions tech leader, but it's not all of the story. I would like to see Australia with the countries that it partners with, including India, not just come up with the new breakthrough technology, but then see that technology through to commercialization and towards globally competitive new export opportunities. That, for me, is really the heart of technological leadership. If I can go to the next slide. Now, I've spoken a lot to these ones already, so if we can go forward another slide, please. Now, in terms of what technologies we chose through that process that I've just described and how we came up with or how our minister wanted to see these technologies deployed. One way to try and deploy technologies, low emissions technologies, once they're developed, is to increase the cost of existing high emissions technologies. So, for example, by taxing existing coal-fired power or existing fossil fuel generation. That's one pathway towards trying to encourage low emissions technologies. The other pathway is to try and provide support, encourage deployment and innovation in these low emissions technologies to bring their costs down so that they are cost competitive with the existing technologies. And that was the approach that Australia really wants to embark on. So one thing that our team did was, at the request of the minister, was that we looked at, through the process that I described earlier, the panel, along with our analytical experts and the minister, we came up with this list of 5 technologies. And you'll see that there's 6 there because one was added after my time. But we came up with 5 initial technologies plus ultra-low-cost solar, which was added this year. But this is from the list of over 160 or 70 technologies by the time the survey had run. We looked at these and we assessed which had the greatest potential to deliver emission abatement, where the technologies were at. So all of those things together, we narrowed the list down to this 6, and I'll quickly go through them. But we identified the cost point at which these technologies would become cost competitive with existing higher emissions alternatives. So, for example, clean hydrogen production at $2 per kilogram. At that price, clean hydrogen would become cost competitive with natural gas in a number of applications. For example, our analysis showed that at $2 per kilogram, hydrogen would be cost competitive in heavy vehicles, for example. Perhaps in some gas blending, it would become cost competitive. Perhaps not across the board, but in certain niche applications, a demand stream would flow from $2 per kilogram hydrogen. If we take another one of electricity from storage, now that's a really interesting one, and I would love to hear from other panelists and people in the audience as to how this would measure up in India. But at $100 per megawatt hour, now this is talking not about the end user electricity, but rather the cost that is paid by, for example, an electricity retailer for dispatchable energy from stored electrons in its stack of electricity that it then offers to the consumer. So, for example, you might be paying $100 per megawatt hour for a given percentage of your mix, but you would also be getting very low-cost solar and wind at particular times in the day. But this was the amount that would allow you to firm the electricity from intermittent sources. And so we identified $100. In that same way, we identified cost points at which, if we could get the technology to that level, it would become broadly deployed, not through any further government action, but simply by the fact that it was cost competitive with existing technologies. I'm not sure, by my count, I have a couple of minutes left, so I might just skip forward a slide or two. Can I see my next slide, please? So this is where the financial commitment that the Australian government is making. And by 2030, at least $20 billion will be put into these technologies that we are prioritising. It's important to note that while we decided it was very important for us to prioritise a small group of technologies, because we can't do everything, it was important that each year, through that same process of surveying new developments in technology, we would leave ourselves open to the idea of both adding new technologies, but also taking existing technologies on that list off if they were not performing. So at least $20 billion will be allocated by 2030 to this list of technologies. And with that money, we hope that to drive the innovation, but also drive the commercialization of these technologies. Now, in amongst that $20 billion, it's actually $500 or $500 million that has been allocated to develop our international partnerships. And those international partnerships are being driven by our former chief scientist, who I mentioned, Dr. Finkel. And so Dr. Finkel has been in touch with colleagues in India. We are very close to concluding a partnership with India, and Dr. Finkel will be really interested to meet scientists across India in the future to look at where we can develop these technology partnerships together. If I can just skip forward again. Now, this was some fledgling thinking that me and my team, Radhika Tumar and Shandon Atreya, we have been in India, just thinking about how India's comparative advantages and Australia's might intersect and complement each other. And this is in the example, in a very particular example, in the context of battery manufacture. And as you know, as you would know, the Indian government had very high ambitions on the deployment of renewable energy, but it also has very high ambitions in terms of manufacture of batteries and the batteries adding value to batteries supply here within India. Now, while that's a very strong ambition, these supply chains move very, very quickly and evolve very quickly. So if we look at lithium batteries, we don't really have that long before new technologies, maybe in 20 years' time, might have already displaced some of these technologies. So if we want to make a globally competitive offering, we need to move very quickly. And what Australia and India are now trying to do is to add value in each of our countries, but then partner to bring those offerings to market more quickly. And as a basic schematic, Australia is very strong in terms of its mining sector. We have excellent upstream infrastructure in, for example, critical minerals and other things. India at the moment is manufacturing manufacturing batteries, but largely through imported components. But what we can see and what we are looking forward to in terms of a vision is that Australia and India can both add more value to meet in the middle of this supply chain so that we can bring more value-added products to the market. And this same schematic, in my mind, applies in a variety of other sectors. I don't want to overstretch my time, so I might just leave it there and hand it back to the organisers, and I'm very, very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Sanjiva, thank you so much for being here. Sorry, it's just too late. I'm sure the audience would have liked to ask you a lot of questions, but given the time constraints, we couldn't take any questions. But we will surely be reaching out to you. And also the very methodical way in which your country works. I hope some of that we adopt here, both at an institute level and also nationally. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Sanjiva, I've asked Amy for a copy of that key slide that you had, which actually shows dollar figures. And I was hoping they were Australian dollars. I was hoping they were US dollars, because Australian dollars, those numbers are going to be very challenging. But so Amy will get me the slide. Thank you.
Thank you, professors. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to working with you.